Lorraine Prescott had been 62 years old for exactly 3 weeks when her world ended. Not with a bang, not with a scream, but with a sentence spoken over morning coffee in the kitchen she had maintained for 4 decades. She was standing at the counter, the same granite counter she had picked out 17 years ago during the renovation, pouring coffee into the same 2 mugs she poured coffee into every morning. One black one with cream and half a sugar. 4 decades of mornings, 4 decades of knowing exactly how her husband took his coffee. A lifetime of small devotions that stacked together formed the architecture of a life nobody ever bothered to notice. The house was immaculate. It was always immaculate. Lorraine had spent her entire marriage perfecting the art of maintaining a home that looked effortless, a home where dinner guests marveled at the decor and the food and the seamless way everything flowed. Nobody ever saw the work behind it. That was the point. The best homes, like the best wives, were supposed to be invisible in their labor. You were not supposed to see the scrubbing or the planning or the careful calibration of a life that existed primarily to make other people comfortable. You were supposed to walk in and feel at ease and never once wonder who made it that way. She heard Douglas come down the stairs. His footsteps were different that morning. She would remember that later, would replay those footsteps in her mind 100 times in the months that followed. Not the heavy, distracted tread of a man thinking about contracts and closing deals. Something lighter, something rehearsed. Like a man who had already decided where he was going and was just passing through on his way out the door. He appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing a suit she did not recognize. Charcoal gray slim, cut the kind of suit a younger man would wear. Not the broad-shouldered power suits Douglas had worn for 30 years, the ones Lorraine had picked up from the dry cleaner every Thursday. This was something new, something chosen for someone else's eyes. He did not sit down at the breakfast table the way he always did. He stood. That was the first warning. In their long marriage, Lorraine had learned to read the geometry of her husband's body the way a sailor reads the sky. When he sat, he was staying. When he stood, he was leaving. And Douglas Prescott was standing as far from her as the kitchen would allow, his back nearly touching the doorframe, his body already angled toward the hallway, toward the front door, toward whatever waited outside. "We need to talk," he said. 4 words. The 4 worst words in the English language, when spoken by a spouse who will not meet your eyes. Lorraine felt her stomach drop the way it does when a plane hits turbulence, that sickening lurch between what was and what is about to be. She set down the coffee mug, his coffee mug, the one she would never pour coffee into again, though she did not know that yet. They moved to the living room. The living room Lorraine had decorated and redecorated 4 times over the decades, each version a reflection of where they were in life. The early years with secondhand furniture and optimism. The middle years with the children's toys scattered like landmines across the carpet. The later years with tasteful neutrals and framed family photos, and the quiet hum of a life well built. Every corner of this room held a memory. Christmas mornings, when the children ripped wrapping paper with abandon, while Douglas filmed from the armchair. Birthday parties with too many balloons. The night their son Garrett took his first steps right there between the couch and the coffee table, his little legs wobbling, his face split with a grin of pure triumph, while Douglas captured it on a camcorder that now sat forgotten in a closet upstairs. Douglas sat across from her, not beside her. After all those years together, he chose distance. That detail would stay with Lorraine for the rest of her life. The deliberate space between them. The way he positioned himself like a businessman across a negotiating table, not a husband beside his wife. He crossed his legs. He folded his hands. He took a breath, and Lorraine watched him take that breath the way you watch someone load a gun. "I want a divorce," he said it flatly. No tremor, no hesitation. The way a man reads a prepared statement. And Lorraine understood immediately that this had been rehearsed, that he had stood in front of some mirror or maybe in some other woman's apartment and practiced these words until they came out smooth and clean and final. Until every ounce of emotion had been polished away, leaving only the decision. "I have met someone else. Someone who makes me feel alive again. Someone who understands me." The words landed like physical blows, each one a fist to the chest. Lorraine gripped the arm of the sofa, her knuckles white, and tried to breathe through what felt like drowning. The living room, her living room, the room where her children had learned to walk and talk and laugh, seemed to tilt on its axis. The family photos on the mantel stared down at her with frozen smiles from a life that had already ended. who she managed. That does not matter. What matters is that I am done. I have already spoken to my lawyer. You will be hearing from them. Done. Like a project completed, like a contract expired, like their shared life was a subscription he had decided not to renew. Douglas, she said, and her voice sounded foreign to her own ears, thin and distant, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. We have been married for 40 years. We have children, grandchildren. We built a life together. A life that I am tired of, he interrupted. And then he said the thing that would burn in her memory like a brand, the words she would carry with her up a mountain and into a ruin and through every cold, lonely night that followed. Lorraine, look at yourself. You are 62 years old. You have let yourself go. You have become invisible. Vanessa makes me feel young, vital. She is 32. She is ambitious. She sees me. 32. Lorraine whispered it. The number sat between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. 32 years old, the same age as their daughter Shelby. He was leaving her for a woman their daughter's age. A woman who had been a toddler when Lorraine was already a decade into her marriage, already deep into the invisible labor of making Douglas Prescott's life run smoothly. I deserve to be happy, Douglas continued, and now there was something almost righteous in his tone, the voice of a man who had convinced himself that selfishness was the same as courage. I have worked hard my entire life. I have provided for you, given you everything. Now I want to live for myself. Provided. The words sat in the air like an accusation. As if her decades of managing the household, raising the children, supporting his career, entertaining his clients, keeping his home, keeping his schedule, keeping his life running smoothly, while her own life ran in the background like a program nobody bothered to monitor, as if all of that was nothing. As if she had been a guest in her own marriage, eating at his table, sleeping under his roof, contributing nothing of value. As if the word homemaker was a polite euphemism for passenger. I want you out of the house by the end of the week, Douglas said, already standing, already leaving, already done with this conversation in this marriage. And this woman who had given him everything and was now learning exactly how much that everything was worth. My lawyer will be in touch about the proceedings. And just like that, he walked out. Left for the office, or maybe for Vanessa's apartment, or maybe for some place where 62-year-old wives did not exist to remind him that he too was aging, that he too was mortal, that no amount of tailored suits and 32-year-old girlfriends could stop the clock. The front door closed behind him with a sound that was somehow both quiet and deafening. Lorraine sat alone in the living room she had built and understood with terrible clarity that her life as she had known it was over. The coffee grew cold on the counter. Both mugs, his and hers. The clock on the mantel ticked into the silence. And the house, the beautiful, immaculate house she had maintained, like a museum of a perfect marriage, pressed down on her with the weight of every lie it had ever told. The next 3 months were a masterclass in humiliation. Douglas's legal team operated with the precision of a military campaign. Every maneuver calculated, every argument prepared, every exit sealed before Lorraine even understood where the doors were. 3 lawyers, all men, all expensive, trained to reduce a marriage to a spreadsheet of assets and liabilities. And on that spreadsheet, Lorraine Prescott was a liability. Every asset, they argued with clinical detachment, was the direct result of Douglas Prescott's professional labor. The house on Maple Ridge purchased with his income, the 2 cars his earnings, the retirement accounts his career, the investment portfolio his financial acumen. Lorraine had been a homemaker, they pointed out repeatedly, as if the word itself was a confession of inadequacy. She had contributed no financial value to the marriage. The fact that she had enabled Douglas's career by managing everything else, that she had sacrificed her own ambitions to raise their children, that she had been his partner and his foundation, and the reason he could pour every ounce of energy into building his business while never once worrying about a school pickup or a grocery list or a dentist appointment or a birthday party or a broken dishwasher or the 10,000 other emergencies and obligations that constitute the invisible infrastructure of a family, none of that appeared on the spreadsheet. A lifetime of labor, invisible labor, and it was worth exactly 0 in the cold mathematics of divorce court. But it was during the discovery phase that Lorraine received the cruelest blow of all. While reviewing financial documents, her court-appointed lawyer, a young woman barely older than Vanessa, who was clearly overwhelmed by the case and visibly uncomfortable delivering bad news, found something buried in bank statements. 6 months before Douglas announced the divorce, he had begun systematically transferring money from their joint savings into a private account. Small amounts at first designed not to trigger attention, 2,000 here, 3,000 there. Then larger sums as the divorce approached, 5 figures at a time, the transfers accelerating with the confidence of a man who knew his wife did not check the accounts because she trusted him. By the time Douglas sat in that kitchen and said the words, he had moved nearly $200,000 out of their shared life. He had been planning this for months. While Lorraine cooked his dinners and pressed his shirts and asked about his day with genuine interest, he had been methodically stripping their shared life down to its bones. The late nights at the office, the new cologne, the gym membership, the business trips that seemed to multiply, all of it had been preparation. Not just for Vanessa, for the financial dismantling of his wife. Lorraine's lawyer raised the transfers in a hearing. Douglas's team had an answer ready. They always had answers ready. Mr. Prescott moved those funds in preparation for a business investment, they explained smoothly. The timing is coincidental. The judge noted the objection but did not press the issue. The money had evaporated into Douglas's business accounts mixed with commercial real estate transactions untraceable without a forensic accountant that Lorraine could not afford. She had been outmaneuvered before the fight even began. Douglas had spent 30 years closing real estate deals. He understood leverage and timing and the art of structuring a negotiation so the other side had nothing left to negotiate with. He had used those skills on his own wife with the same cold efficiency he applied to commercial properties. Their children tried to remain neutral. Garrett, 38, a project manager in Denver, called weekly with the cautious diplomacy of a man trying to keep both parents happy. He loved his mother. He loved his father. He did not want to choose, and his refusal to choose felt to Lorraine like a choice in itself. He spoke in careful sentences. He avoided blame. He said things like, "I am sure there are two sides and it is not my place to judge." Each word was a small blade. Shelby, 35, a school teacher in Portland, was warmer but equally careful. She told Lorraine she was sorry. She said it was not fair. But she did not say what Lorraine needed to hear, that their father was wrong, that what he was doing was cruel, that Lorraine deserved better. Nobody said that. Nobody stood up. Nobody looked at this 62-year-old woman being systematically stripped of everything she had built and said out loud what everyone could see, that this was unjust. Lorraine faced this alone. The final hearing was on a gray morning in November, 2 months after Douglas had ended their marriage with a sentence. The courtroom smelled of floor wax and stale coffee and the accumulated disappointment of 1,000 dissolved unions. Lorraine sat in a navy blue dress she had bought at a secondhand store because she could no longer afford new clothes. Her court-appointed lawyer sat beside her, a stack of papers organized in a manila folder, clearly outgunned by the 3-lawyer team at the opposite table. Douglas sat across the aisle in a suit that cost more than Lorraine's monthly budget, and beside him, touching his arm with proprietary ease, smiling at him adoringly, was Vanessa. Lorraine looked at her. She could not help it. Vanessa was everything Lorraine was not: young, blonde, wearing a dress that probably cost a month's rent. Her skin was smooth, her teeth were white. Her confidence was the unearned confidence of a woman who had never been told she was invisible because the world had never stopped looking at her. She was 32, the same age Lorraine had been when she gave birth to Shelby. A lifetime ago. A different woman ago. Vanessa caught Lorraine looking and smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who had won and knew it and wanted to make sure the loser knew it too. Lorraine looked away. She looked at the judge. She looked at her hands folded in her lap, the hands that had cooked 10,000 meals and changed diapers and held 2 babies and built a home from nothing and now held nothing again. The judge, a tired man with reading glasses and the bored expression of someone who had presided over too many endings, read through the settlement in a flat monotone. Douglas would keep the house. Douglas would keep the cars. Douglas would retain the majority of the retirement accounts. Lorraine would receive a modest monthly alimony for 5 years. Enough time to get on her feet, the judge said, reading the phrase from the document as if it were reasonable. As if 62-year-old women discarded after a lifetime of service could simply get on their feet and start fresh. As if starting fresh were something you could do at 62, with no career, no savings, no work history, and no identity outside the marriage that had just been dissolved. There is one additional property, Douglas's lead lawyer said. He said it almost as an afterthought, the way you mention a scratch on a car you are selling. A cabin in the mountains of Colorado that Mr. Prescott inherited from his father. It has been abandoned for approximately 20 years. No utilities, no assessed value. We propose deeding the property to Mrs. Prescott as part of the settlement. Douglas leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something. They both smirked. The lawyer straightened his tie, a small gesture of self-satisfaction that Lorraine would remember. My client is willing to deed the property to Mrs. Prescott. Consider it a gesture of goodwill. Goodwill? The word hung in the courtroom like smoke. Lorraine's lawyer looked at her with a question in her eyes. What do you want to do? Lorraine had nothing left to lose. The house was gone. The money was gone. The marriage was gone. Her pride was gone. Her future was gone. What was one more piece of nothing added to all the other nothing? Fine, she said quietly. The judge banged his gavel. The marriage of Douglas and Lorraine Prescott was legally dissolved. All those years, 2 children, a lifetime of invisible labor, ended with a sound like a door slamming shut. Lorraine stood, she gathered her purse and her manila folder and her dignity, what was left of it. She walked toward the courtroom doors with her back straight and her eyes forward and her jaw clenched against the tide rising in her chest. She would not give them the satisfaction. She would not crumble here. Not in front of him, not in front of her. But Douglas could not resist. Even in victory, he could not resist the urge to twist the knife one final turn. Enjoy the cabin, he called after her. His voice carried across the courtroom with the easy arrogance of a man who believed he had won everything worth winning. Try not to let it collapse on you. Vanessa giggled. The sound was high and bright and cruel, a sound that would echo in Lorraine's memory for months, that would follow her up a mountain and into the dark of a ruined cabin and through every moment when she wanted to quit. Lorraine kept walking, through the courtroom doors, down the hallway with its fluorescent lights and tile floors, past the security guards and the metal detectors and the other broken people waiting for their own endings. She walked through the front doors of the courthouse into the gray November air, and she made it all the way to her car, a 12-year-old sedan with a dent in the passenger door, before she broke. She sat in the parking lot and she cried. Not delicate tears, not quiet, dignified grief. She sobbed the way you sob when the ground has been pulled out from under you and there is nothing to grab and nothing to hold and the falling will not stop. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and wept until her chest hurt and her throat was raw and her eyes burned and there was nothing left inside her but the emptiness that grief leaves behind when it has taken everything it came for. 62 years old, divorced, nearly destitute, nowhere to go. Nothing to her name but a worthless cabin that her ex-husband had given her as a joke, a final act of contempt, dressed up as generosity. This was her life now. This was how decades of devotion ended, with mockery and a ruin. Lorraine spent her last week in the house packing her life into boxes. Douglas had graciously given her 7 days. 7 days to dismantle 4 decades. She moved through the rooms like a ghost touching walls, opening drawers, running her fingers along surfaces she had polished 1,000 times, trying to decide what pieces of her old life were worth carrying into whatever came next. She started with the bedroom. Their bedroom. The bed where she had slept beside Douglas for 37 years, the same bed where her children had climbed in on Sunday mornings, where she had read novels late at night, while Douglas snored beside her, where she had lain awake so many nights, wondering if the distance she felt between them was real or imagined. The bedspread was one she had chosen 2 years ago. A deep blue that Douglas had never commented on, never noticed. She left it. The bed was not hers to take. The closet was harder. Her clothes hung on the left side, his on the right, the same arrangement they had maintained for decades. She pulled her dresses and blouses from the hangers and folded them into boxes, and each empty hanger felt like a small amputation. On the top shelf, she found a box of greeting cards she had saved. Birthday cards from Douglas, from the years when he still wrote personal messages. To my beautiful wife, one read in handwriting she recognized from a time when he still put pen to paper for her. Thank you for making our house a home. She put the cards in the trash. She could not afford the weight of that kind of irony. The kitchen was the worst. She had spent more hours in this kitchen than in any other room in the house. She knew every drawer, every cabinet, every quirk of the aging dishwasher that you had to close with a hip check to get it to latch. The spice rack she had organized alphabetically, the knife set she had bought with her own birthday money, the cast iron skillet that had been her mother's, seasoned with decades of oil and heat and memory. She took the skillet, she took a set of dishes that had been a wedding gift from her own family. Everything else she left. The kitchen belonged to the house, and the house belonged to Douglas now. She took what fit in the sedan. Clothes, photo albums that documented a family's life in snapshots and milestones. A few pieces of furniture that had been hers before the marriage, a rocking chair from her mother, a small writing desk that had belonged to her grandmother. Things that predated Douglas, that belonged to who she had been before she became his wife and lost track of everything else. Everything else, the carefully curated home, the art on the walls, the garden she had tended for 20 years stayed behind. For Douglas, for Vanessa, for whatever version of life they would build on the bones of hers. Her friends from the neighborhood were kind, but awkward. Divorce was a social virus in suburban communities. People did not know which side to stand on, so they stood at a safe distance. Some sided quietly with Douglas choosing the version of events that was easier to believe that Lorraine had let herself go, become boring, failed to keep up. Others offered sympathy that felt like pity, and pity was almost worse than blame. A few brought casseroles, the universal language of, I do not know what else to do. Lorraine accepted them and ate them alone, and tried not to think about the fact that she had spent decades bringing casseroles to other people's crises, and had never once imagined she would be on the receiving end. At 62, discarded and broke, Lorraine Prescott was becoming exactly what Douglas had called her, invisible. Garrett and Shelby each called offering spare rooms, but Lorraine heard the hesitation beneath the generosity, the way they framed it as temporary, the unspoken concern about disrupting their own households, their own marriages, their own carefully maintained routines. Their spare rooms were offerings of guilt more than genuine welcome. Her children loved her. She believed that. But love and inconvenience were different currencies, and she would not spend her remaining years as a burden in someone else's home, a gray-haired reminder of failure sleeping in a guest bedroom surrounded by someone else's furniture. I have the cabin, she told them. I am going to stay there for a while. Figure things out. Mom, that place is a disaster, Shelby said bluntly. Dad said it has been abandoned for 20 years. There is no electricity, no water, no anything. Then it will suit me perfectly, Lorraine replied. She tried to hide the bitterness, but it bled through anyway, sharp and metallic, the taste of a woman swallowing rage. On a cold morning in the first week of December, Lorraine loaded the last box into her sedan. She stood in the driveway of the house she had called home for 3 decades and looked at it one final time. The windows she had cleaned every spring, the shutters she had painted, the flower beds she had planted and replanted through the season's tulips and spring roses and summer mums. In fall, every bed a testament to care that nobody noticed until it stopped. All of it someone else's now. She did not say goodbye. Goodbye was for people who expected to return. She got in the car and drove north. For the first hour, she cried while she drove. Not the wrenching sobs of the courthouse parking lot, but a quieter grief. The steady leak of tears that comes when the shock has worn off and the reality has settled in, and you understand with complete clarity that you are driving away from everything you have known and towards something you cannot imagine. She passed the shopping center where she had bought groceries every Tuesday for 20 years. She passed the elementary school where Garrett and Shelby had attended, where she had volunteered for bake sales and chaperoned field trips, and sat through school plays in a folding metal chair, applauding performances that were terrible and beautiful at the same time. She passed the park where she had walked the dog. They used to have a golden retriever named Murphy who had died 7 years ago, and whose absence still left a hollow in the house that neither she nor Douglas had ever acknowledged. She drove past all of it, every landmark of her former life, and watched them shrink in the rearview mirror until they were gone. The second hour, the crying stopped. Something harder took its place. Not peace, not acceptance. Something closer to numbness, the emotional equivalent of the silence that follows an explosion. She drove with both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road, and her mind carefully, deliberately empty. She did not think about Douglas. She did not think about Vanessa. She did not think about the house, or the money, or the look on the judge's face when he read the settlement. She thought about nothing. Nothing was safe. Nothing could not hurt her. The third hour, she began to notice the landscape. The drive took 3 hours. Paved highways became county roads. County roads became gravel. Gravel became a rutted dirt track barely visible through overgrown brush, and the December sky hung low and gray above the mountains like a ceiling pressing down on the world. The towns grew smaller and farther apart. The last gas station was 30 miles back. The last cell signal had disappeared 20 minutes ago. She was driving into wilderness, into isolation, into the kind of emptiness that either breaks you or rebuilds you, and she did not yet know which it would be. She almost missed the turnoff. A faded wooden sign, half-rotted, leaning at an angle that suggested one more winter would bring it down entirely. Prescott property, no trespassing. The irony cut deep. She had been trespassing in her own life for as long as she could remember. Living in someone else's house, building someone else's dream, disappearing into someone else's story, until there was nothing left of her own. At least here in this wilderness of pine and rock and silence, whatever she built would be hers. The track wound through dense forest for another quarter-mile before the trees opened into a small clearing, and there it was. Lorraine stopped the car. She turned off the engine, and she stared. Douglas had called it dilapidated. He had been generous. The structure was a catastrophe. A small log cabin, maybe 800 square feet, with a porch that had collapsed entirely on the left side, the boards hanging like broken fingers. The roof sagged in the middle like the spine of a broken animal. Several windows were shattered, their frames dark and empty, like missing teeth in a rotting skull. Vines and moss covered the exterior so thoroughly that the cabin seemed to be in the process of being swallowed by the mountain itself, consumed by the wilderness it had once held back. 20 years of abandonment had turned it into something between a building and a grave. It looked like the kind of place where hope came to die. Lorraine sat in her car for a long time. The engine ticked as it cooled. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. She thought about Shelby's spare room with its clean sheets and working heater. She thought about Garrett's basement with its pull-out couch and cable television. She thought about turning around, driving back, calling her children, admitting that Douglas was right, that she was too old, too soft, too broken for this. Then she thought about his laugh in the courtroom, the way it had echoed off the walls, the casual cruelty of a man who believed he had won so completely that he could afford to mock her in public, the giggle that followed, high and bright and sharp as glass. Try not to let it collapse on you. Something hardened in Lorraine's chest, something old and stubborn and deeply, quietly furious. She had spent her entire adult life being agreeable, being accommodating, being the woman who smoothed things over, who kept the peace, who swallowed her own needs to maintain the comfort of others. And where had it gotten her? A parking lot, a courtroom, a ruin, no more. "He will not see me fall," Lorraine said aloud. Her voice was rough from crying and thin in the cold air, but it was hers, the first real thing she had said in months, the first sentence spoken for herself instead of for someone else. She opened the car door and stepped out into the December cold. The mountain air hit her like a slap, sharp and clean, scented with pine and earth and snow. Silence surrounded her, not the silence of a suburban house waiting for someone to come home. Real silence. The silence of a world that did not know her name and did not care about her divorce and would not pity her or judge her or look away uncomfortably when she walked into a room. Nothing but wind in the trees and the distant call of something wild. After months of humiliation and noise, the silence felt like mercy. She approached the cabin, carefully testing the remaining porch steps before putting her weight on them. The front door was locked, but the wood around the lock was so rotted that a firm push broke it open. The door swung inward with a groan that sounded almost human. The smell hit her first. Mold, decay, animal droppings, the accumulated rot of 2 decades of abandonment. It was the smell of something forgotten, something left behind, something no one had cared enough to save. The interior was worse than the exterior had promised. One large room with a small kitchen area, a stone fireplace blackened with old soot, and a loft accessible by a ladder that was missing several rungs. Everything was buried under layers of dust and debris. Holes in the roof had let in years of rain and snow, leaving dark stains across the walls like bruises. The wood floor was rotted through in multiple places, dark and soft and dangerous. The kind of soft that means one wrong step and you go through. A raccoon had built a nest in the corner, abandoned now, but leaving behind the mess of its occupation. Something larger had clawed deep scratches into the wall near the fireplace gouges in the wood that spoke of teeth and hunger. It was uninhabitable. It was a health hazard. It was the punchline to a cruel joke told by a man who wanted his ex-wife to understand exactly how little she was worth. Lorraine stood in the center of the ruin. She looked at the sagging roof and the broken windows and the rotted floor and the walls thick with mold. She looked at all of it, the final insult, the last thing Douglas Prescott had given her after a lifetime of marriage. And she felt something she had not felt in months, maybe years. Anger. Not the polite, swallowed frustration she had carried through her marriage like a stone in her pocket. Real anger. Clean anger. The kind that burns away everything weak and leaves only what is strong enough to survive the fire. The kind that straightens your spine and clears your vision and tells you in a voice that permits no argument that you are not done. Fine, she said to the empty cabin. To Douglas, to Vanessa, to the judge and the lawyers, and the children who would not take sides, and the friends who looked away, and the whole world that had decided Lorraine Prescott was finished. Fine. You want me to disappear into this dump? Let us see what I make of it. That first night she cried. There was no avoiding it and no shame in it. She laid her sleeping bag on the least damaged section of floor as far from the holes in the roof as she could manage. She had no heat except the emergency blankets she had bought at a gas station, thin metallic sheets that crinkled every time she moved and retained approximately none of the warmth they promised. No light except the flashlight on her phone, which she turned off to save the battery, plunging the cabin into a darkness so complete that she could not see her hand in front of her face. No sound except the wind finding its way through every crack and gap in the walls, a low, persistent moan that sounded like the mountain itself was grieving. The temperature dropped steadily through the night. She could feel it, the cold advancing across the floor, like a tide seeping through the sleeping bag, through the emergency blankets, through her clothes and into her skin, and from her skin into her bones. She pulled her knees to her chest. She wrapped her arms around herself. She tried to remember the last time she had been warm. The house on Maple Ridge had always been warm. Douglas kept the thermostat at 72. She had taken warmth for granted, the way she had taken everything for granted, the way you take things for granted when someone else is paying the bills, and you do not realize until the bills stop that comfort has a price, and the price is dependence. She lay in the dark of the cabin that was supposed to be her grave, and she let herself break. All those years, all that devotion and sacrifice, and invisible labor, and this was the reward. A 62-year-old woman alone on a rotting floor in a condemned cabin in the mountains, discarded like something that had outlived its usefulness. She thought about Douglas in the warm house. She thought about him eating dinner at the table she had set 10,000 times, eating food that Vanessa had probably ordered from a restaurant because Vanessa did not seem like the kind of woman who cooked. She thought about them laughing. She thought about them not thinking about her at all. She cried until she was empty, until there was nothing left but exhaustion and the cold and the sound of her own breathing in the dark. And somewhere in the small hours of the morning, when the cold had become so severe that her body was shivering continuously and her teeth were chattering, and the darkness felt like a physical weight on her chest, something happened that Lorraine would not understand until much later. The grief burned through to the bottom and hit something solid, something that had been there all along, buried under decades of accommodation and compliance and the systematic dismantling of her own desires. A floor beneath the pain, a foundation she did not know she had. She stopped crying. Not because the sadness was gone, because something stronger had replaced it. Something that would not let her die on this floor. Something that said in a voice that was hers and not hers, that was older than her marriage and deeper than her grief. Not like this. You will not end like this. But the next morning, Lorraine Prescott opened her eyes, and the first thing she saw was sunlight. It came through the broken windows and the holes in the roof, and it fell across the ruined floor in patterns of gold and shadow. And it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen because she was alive to see it. The cabin was still a disaster. Her life was still in pieces. She was still 62 and alone and afraid. But she was alive. She was not done. And she absolutely, categorically, with every stubborn fiber of her being, refused to let Douglas Prescott have the satisfaction of breaking her. Lorraine stood up. Every muscle in her body screamed from the cold and the hard floor and the night spent shivering. She dried her eyes. She squared her shoulders the way her mother had taught her to do when she was a girl, facing something hard, when the world was too big and the problem was too heavy, and the only option was to stand up straight and walk into it anyway. And she got to work. The first week was about survival. Nothing more, nothing less. Just the raw, grinding work of making a condemned structure livable enough that it would not kill her. Lorraine had some money, not much. The alimony payments would not begin for another month, lost somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery of the court system. But she had a small savings account, one she had maintained quietly for years, depositing birthday checks from her sister and small amounts skimmed from grocery budgets. Douglas had never known about it. In a marriage where every major dollar flowed through her husband's hands, this account had been her only act of financial independence, her one secret. It held $4,600. It was everything she had in the world. She spent it carefully, each purchase weighed and considered the way you weigh choices when every dollar might be the last one that matters. A camping stove, bottles of water, industrial cleaning supplies, work gloves, the heavy kind with reinforced palms, trash bags, the industrial strength ones meant for construction debris, a breathing mask, a basic toolkit, a tarp large enough to cover the worst of the roof holes. The nearest town was 40 minutes down the mountain, a small community called Ridgecrest, with one general store, one gas station, one diner, and a hardware store run by a man named Hank Coulter. Hank was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered and quiet, the way mountain people often are, the kind of quiet that comes from living in a place where weather and terrain do most of the talking. He watched Lorraine load cleaning supplies and tarps onto the counter during her first visit without comment. During her second visit, when she bought a crowbar and a handsaw and more trash bags than any one person should reasonably need, he spoke. Big project. Lorraine looked at him. She was too tired for small talk and too proud for pity. Reclaiming my life, she said. Hank studied her for a moment the way you study a person when you are deciding whether they are serious or just talking. Then he nodded once the way men nod when they recognize something in another person that does not require discussion. He rang up her purchases and carried them to her car without being asked. When she tried to pay for the help, he waved her off. Good luck up there, he said. That was all he said. It was enough. Back at the cabin, Lorraine started with the most fundamental need. She could not live with the smell. Even if everything else remained broken, she could at least make the space clean. She opened every window that still opened, letting December mountain air blast through the interior. The cold was brutal, but it was honest cold, better than the warm rot that had been festering inside these walls for 2 decades. She began filling trash bags. Old newspapers from the 1990s yellowed and brittled their headlines reporting a world that had moved on without this cabin. Animal nests made of shredded insulation and dead leaves. Broken furniture too far gone to identify chairs that had become abstract sculptures of decay. Unnameable things in corners that she chose not to examine closely. Bag after bag dragged through the front door and stacked outside like a barricade against her old life. The work was punishing. Lorraine had not done physical labor like this in decades. Her back screamed after the first hour, a deep muscular protest that traveled up her spine and settled behind her eyes. Her hands, softened by years of relatively light housework, blistered on the first day, cracked and bled on the second, and by the third day were raw enough to make gripping the crowbar an exercise in willpower. Her knees ached. Her shoulders seized when she lifted anything above waist height. She had to stop every 30 minutes to catch her breath, bent over with her hands on her thighs, muscles trembling, sweat cooling on her skin in the frigid air. She was not 25 anymore. She was not even 45. She was 62, and her body reminded her of this constantly, relentlessly, in the language of pain and exhaustion, and the specific humiliation of a body that cannot do what the mind demands. But she kept going. There was something almost meditative in the labor. Each bag of trash she hauled out was a piece of the old life discarded. Each surface she scrubbed was a small territory reclaimed. The work did not care about her age or her divorce or her grief. The work only cared that she showed up and did it. And showing up, she discovered, was something she was very good at. She had been showing up for other people her entire adult life. The only difference now was that she was showing up for herself. By the end of the first week, the cabin was empty of debris. It was still ruined. The floor was still rotted through in places. The roof still leaked when it rained. The walls were still covered in mold and water damage, and the scars of 20 years of neglect. But it was clean ruin, organized ruin, ruin with potential. That was progress. During the second week, Lorraine tackled the mold. She had read about it online during one of her trips to town, sitting in the Ridgecrest Diner, using their slow Wi-Fi, learning about black mold and remediation and the health risks of breathing spores in an enclosed space. She bought industrial mold killer and additional breathing masks from Hank's store. He showed her which product worked best on deep wood penetration without saying more than 10 words. She appreciated that about him. He helped without hovering, advised without condescending, treated her like a person doing a job, not a charity case deserving sympathy. She spent days scrubbing walls. The breathing mask pressed against her face for hours at a time, fogging her glasses, making her feel claustrophobic. Her arms burned from the repetitive motion, the same muscles used over and over until they cramped and shook. The mold had penetrated deep into the wood in several areas, black tendrils reaching into the grain like veins of poison. Those sections would need to be replaced entirely. She had no idea how to do that, but she could at least clean what was cleanable. She could at least fight the battle in front of her and worry about the next one later. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of February. Lorraine was on her knees in what had been the kitchen area, scrubbing a particularly stubborn section of moldy wall near where the old stovepipe came through. The work was monotonous. Spray, scrub, wipe, spray, scrub, wipe. Her mind had gone to that blank, meditative place that hard labor creates, the state where you are nothing but motion and breath in the task in your hands. She pressed the brush hard against the wall and heard something odd, a hollow sound, not the solid thunk of wood backed by log and earth, a reverberation, an emptiness behind the surface. Lorraine stopped. She knocked on the wall with her knuckles. Hollow. She moved 2 feet to the left and knocked again. Solid. Back to the original spot. Hollow. She looked more closely. The boards here were different from the rest of the wall, slightly narrower, installed with different nails, older nails, square-headed and hand-forged, the kind that predated mass manufacturing. Someone had built this section separately. Someone had built it to look like the rest of the wall while concealing something behind it. Lorraine's heart began to beat faster. She told herself it was probably nothing. A gap in the construction. An old storage space for firewood or tools. There was no reason to get excited. But her hands were already reaching for the crowbar. The wood was old and weakened by decades of moisture. It gave way easily, almost eagerly, as if it had been waiting for someone to finally ask what it was hiding. The first board came free with a groan, then the second, then a third, and suddenly Lorraine was looking into a space she had not known existed. A hidden compartment, not large, maybe 2 feet deep, 3 feet wide, running from floor to ceiling. A deliberately constructed void in the wall of the cabin, sealed and concealed with care by someone who wanted whatever was inside to stay hidden and stay safe. Why would someone build a hidden compartment in a mountain cabin? What would they need to hide so carefully? Lorraine shined her flashlight into the space. Dust motes swirled in the beam like tiny planets. Cobwebs stretched across the opening, thick and old, undisturbed for what must have been generations. And there at the bottom of the compartment, sitting on the bare earth beneath the floor, was a box. A wooden box. About the size of a large shoebox, made of cedar. Lorraine could smell it the moment the wall opened, that distinctive, clean, sharp scent cutting through the mold and decay like a blade through fog. Cedar. Naturally resistant to moisture, insects, rot. That was why whatever was inside had survived when everything around it had crumbled. Someone had chosen this wood deliberately. Someone had built this box to last longer than the cabin itself. Lorraine pulled it out carefully. It was heavier than she expected, dense with the weight of whatever it contained and the weight of years. She sat on the floor with it in her lap, her hands shaking slightly, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was someone's secret. Someone had hidden this deliberately behind a false wall in a cabin in the mountains and had never come back for it, or had died before they could, or had passed the property to someone who never knew the secret was there. Douglas's father had owned this cabin. Before that, Douglas's grandfather. Before that, the property had passed through several hands stretching back over a century. Any of them could have built this compartment. Any of them could have hidden this box. None of them had ever found it. Not even Douglas, the commercial real estate developer who made his fortune evaluating properties, had bothered to look closely at what he owned. Lorraine opened the box. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilcloth that had gone stiff with age but had done its job of keeping moisture out, were two things: a bundle of papers and a cloth bag cinched with a drawstring. She unwrapped the papers first. They were deeds. Old deeds. The paper was thick and rough, the kind of paper they made before machines smoothed everything into uniformity. The handwriting was precise and formal, the penmanship of a different century. As Lorraine read through them slowly, carefully, her lips moving with the effort of deciphering 19th century script, her heart began to pound so hard she could feel it in her throat. The cabin and the surrounding 20 acres had not always been worthless. In 1875, the property had been registered as a mineral claim, specifically a claim on a natural hot spring. The documents described the spring in language that mixed legal precision with barely contained excitement. A subterranean thermal water source of exceptional mineral content. Samples had been collected and analyzed, and the results were detailed in a letter from a chemist in Denver. The water contained high concentrations of sulfur, magnesium, calcium, and trace minerals consistent with therapeutic properties documented at European spa sites. There were more papers. Engineering drawings for a bathhouse detailed and ambitious, showing stone pools fed by natural channels from the spring. Letters from potential investors in Denver and Colorado Springs expressing keen interest in funding a mineral spa resort. A business plan, handwritten but thorough, projecting revenues based on the success of similar operations in Arkansas and Virginia. And then dated 1876, a final note, written in a hand that was less steady than the earlier documents, the penmanship of a man under strain. Development postponed indefinitely due to economic panic. Will return to project when circumstances allow. God willing. The economic panic of 1876. One of those financial crises that swept through the country in the 19th century, destroying fortunes and freezing investment overnight. The owner had run out of money, or his investors had pulled out, or both. The project had died before it was born, and apparently circumstances had never allowed. The owner had died. The property had passed through hands that did not know its history. Eventually, it had ended up with Douglas's grandfather, who had probably used the cabin as a hunting lodge and never bothered to investigate the land beneath his feet. Then Douglas's father, who had done even less with it. Then Douglas himself, who had declared it worthless, too remote, too run down, not worth the property taxes, good for nothing except a tax write-off and a final insult to a discarded wife. Lorraine set down the papers and opened the cloth bag with fingers that would not stop trembling. Inside were rock samples, smooth and mineralized, presumably collected from the area around the spring. And a small glass bottle carefully sealed with wax, containing what must have been the spring water itself. 150 years old, preserved in its little glass tomb, evidence of something remarkable hidden beneath this mountain. Lorraine sat on the cold floor of the ruined cabin, surrounded by mold and decay and the wreckage of her old life, and she held a cedar box full of history and possibility. The property Douglas had given her as trash, as a joke, as the cruelest parting gift a husband could devise, might be worth something, might be worth a great deal, might be the foundation for something extraordinary. She started laughing, then crying, then laughing again, the sounds tangling together in the empty cabin, echoing off the walls that had kept this secret for a century and a half. The irony was so perfect, it was almost unbearable. Douglas Prescott, the successful commercial real estate developer, the man who made his fortune evaluating properties and understanding land value, had sat on a potential gold mine for 20 years and never known it. He had given it away as garbage. He had laughed while doing it. That night, Lorraine drove to Ridgecrest with a purpose she had not felt in months. She needed internet. She needed information. She needed to understand what she might actually have. The diner had Wi-Fi and bottomless coffee for $2. Lorraine sat in a corner booth with her laptop and researched until the owner started stacking chairs. Mineral springs, historical spa resorts, thermal water therapy, property development in Colorado, grant programs for historical preservation. What she learned was both thrilling and terrifying. Natural mineral springs with documented therapeutic properties were genuinely valuable if properly developed. Spa resorts built around such springs generated significant revenue across the country and had done so for over a century. But development required capital, permits, environmental impact studies, infrastructure, engineering. It was not something a 62-year-old woman with $4,000 and a ruined cabin could simply will into existence, unless historical properties she discovered could sometimes qualify for grants and preservation funding. If she could prove the historical significance of the mineral spring and the original development plans, if she could document the site's heritage and demonstrate its potential for cultural preservation, she might be able to access funding that had nothing to do with commercial lending or personal wealth. It was a long shot, a very long shot, the kind of shot that sensible people do not take. But Lorraine Prescott had spent her entire adult life being sensible, and it had gotten her a sleeping bag on a rotted floor. Sensible was finished. Now she was going to be stubborn instead. But first she needed to find the spring. She needed to verify that after 150 years it still existed, still flowed, still held the properties the old documents described. Without that proof, the papers in the cedar box were nothing but historical curiosities. With it, they were the foundation for everything. The deeds gave approximate locations, landmarks referenced to trees and rock formations that had shifted or vanished in the intervening century and a half. Over the following weeks, Lorraine split her days between continuing repairs on the cabin and searching her 20 acres for signs of the spring. She walked the property methodically grid by grid, carrying the old drawings and trying to overlay 19th century maps onto 21st century landscape. She looked for unusual vegetation patterns, ground that stayed soft when everything around it froze hard, moisture where moisture should not be. Any sign that something warm and alive was flowing beneath the frozen surface. She found nothing for weeks. The mountain kept its secrets the way mountains do, with patience and indifference. Meanwhile, the cabin work continued. She learned to patch the roof by watching a man on YouTube explain it 7 times before she trusted herself to climb the ladder. She learned to replace rotted floorboards by buying the wrong wood twice before Hank quietly pointed her toward the right lumber. She installed a wood stove for heat, a project that took 3 days and involved 2 trips to Ridgecrest and 1 moment of genuine fear when she thought the chimney pipe was going to set the wall on fire. Her hands grew calloused. The blisters that had tormented her in the first weeks hardened into rough pads of skin that could grip a hammer without flinching. Her arms grew stronger, the muscles beneath her skin developing a definition they had never had, not even in her 20s. She could carry a sheet of plywood from the truck to the cabin without stopping now. She could swing an axe to split firewood for 20 minutes before needing a break. These were small victories, invisible to anyone watching, but to Lorraine, they were monuments. She developed a routine. Up at dawn, when the mountain light came gray and cold through the windows, she had sealed with plastic sheeting and duct tape. Coffee on the camping stove, then the wood stove feeding at the logs she had split the evening before, waiting for the cabin to warm enough that she could take off her jacket without shivering. Then work. Always work. The cabin demanded it. There was always something rotted that needed replacing, something broken that needed fixing, something that had held together through the night, but revealed a new weakness in the morning light. She ate simply. Canned soup, rice and beans, peanut butter on crackers. Whatever was cheap and kept without refrigeration, because she did not have refrigeration yet, would not have it for months. She lost track of what day it was sometimes. Out here days did not have names. They had tasks. Monday was the day she replaced the window frame in the loft. Tuesday was the day she figured out how to repoint the chimney mortar. Wednesday was the day the roof patch failed and she had to redo it in freezing rain, crying from frustration while water poured down her arms. YouTube became her university. She watched videos on carpentry and plumbing and electrical wiring and roof repair and foundation assessment. She watched them multiple times, pausing and rewinding, studying the hands of men who had spent their lives building things, learning their movements the way a music student learns scales. Then she would drive back to the cabin and attempt what she had learned, and fail and watch the video again, and try again, and eventually gradually succeed. Every skill she learned was a small rebellion against the life she had left behind, against the assumption that she was only capable of cooking and cleaning and looking pleasant at dinner parties. She went to bed exhausted every night. She woke up sore every morning, and she did it again and again because there was no one else to do it. because stopping meant surrendering, and she was not ready to surrender. February turned to March. The days grew slightly longer but no warmer. Temperatures still dropped well below zero at night, and Lorraine's wood stove worked overtime to keep the cabin above freezing. She wore 3 layers of clothing to bed. She woke some mornings to find frost on the inside of the windows, the ones she had not yet managed to properly seal. But she kept searching, every day, walking the property with the methodical patience of a woman who had nothing left to lose and nowhere else to be. The discovery came on a Thursday in early March, 3 weeks after finding the cedar box. She had walked the northwest section of the property a dozen times before a small clearing in the pines that she had dismissed as unremarkable. But on this morning, with fresh snow on the ground from the night before, she noticed something she had never seen. A patch where the snow had melted. A roughly circular area, maybe 10 feet in diameter, where the white blanket covering everything else simply was not there. Bare earth, brown and damp in the dead of winter, surrounded by inches of snow on every side. Heat, underground heat. Something beneath the surface was warm enough to melt snow from below. Lorraine's breath came fast and visible in the cold air. She knelt at the edge of the bare patch and pressed her palm to the ground. Warm. Not hot, but unmistakably warmer than the frozen earth 6 inches away. She pulled off her glove and pressed her bare hand down. Warmth seeped into her cold fingers like a promise. She went back to the cabin for a shovel. She dug. A foot down the earth grew damp. 18 inches and her shovel hit mud. 2 feet in water began seeping into the hole. Not cold groundwater, warm water. She could see the faintest wisps of steam rising from the muddy pool forming at the bottom of her excavation, curling upward into the winter air, like something being released after a very long imprisonment. Lorraine knelt in the snow beside the hole she had dug on land her ex-husband had given her as a joke, and she watched warm mineral water rise from the earth like something being born. She cried. Not from sadness, not from grief, from pure, overwhelming relief and gratitude, and the strange, fierce joy of a woman who has been told she is worth nothing, discovering proof that she was lied to. The spring was real. It was active. It was exactly where the old documents said it would be. After 150 years after economic panics and world wars and the passage of the property through hands that never knew what they held, the water still flowed. The mountain had kept its treasure hidden, waiting for someone stubborn enough and desperate enough to look. That evening, Lorraine called her children for the first time in weeks. "I am okay," she told Garrett first, then Shelby on a separate call. "More than okay. I found something here. Something real." She told them about the hidden compartment, the cedar box, the historical documents, the spring. She told them about the mineral content and the therapeutic properties in the grant programs she had been researching. She told them her plans. Garrett was skeptical. The careful, measured skepticism of a project manager who understood how many things could go wrong. "Mom, be realistic. Developing a mineral spa takes serious money, permits, environmental studies, construction. You cannot just decide to do something like this." "Watch me," Lorraine said, and she heard in her own voice something she had not heard in years. Certainty. Shelby was warmer, but worried. "Mom, I do not want you to get your hopes up and then be crushed again. Even if the spring is real, turning it into something viable could take years." "I know it is hard," Lorraine said. "I know it is a long shot. But for the first time since the divorce, I feel alive. I feel like I have a purpose. I am not asking for permission. I am not asking for help. I am just telling you what I am doing." After she hung up, Lorraine sat in her cabin, now warm from the wood stove, and she planned. She would need environmental testing on the water, historical preservation applications, development permits. She would need to present a compelling case that this property was worth investing in. It would take time and expertise and resources she barely had, but she had something more valuable. She had determination, and she had nothing left to lose. By the end of March, she had submitted applications to 3 historical preservation organizations and 1 environmental grant program. Each application had taken weeks to prepare. She had taught herself to write grant proposals by reading examples online, studying the language and the structure until she could replicate it. She had photographed the historical documents and the spring site. She had written the property story with the careful, persuasive clarity of a woman who understood that this was her one chance. By April, she had received responses. Two rejections formed letters that thanked her for her interest without a trace of human warmth. She read them at the kitchen table she had built from salvaged wood and felt each one like a door closing in her face. The third organization requested additional information, which she provided within 48 hours, typing on her laptop at the Ridgecrest Diner until her coffee went cold and the waitress started giving her sympathetic looks. And the fourth, from the Colorado Historical Preservation Fund, sent a cautiously encouraging letter that said her application had been moved to the review stage. Two closed doors, one half open, one still deciding. It was not the outcome she had hoped for, but it was not nothing. She had learned in these months on the mountain that not nothing was a kind of victory, that the space between failure and success was wider than she had imagined, and that most of the work happened in that middle ground, where you could not see the end, but kept walking anyway. She poured herself into refining the remaining applications, spending evenings at her desk, rewriting sections, strengthening arguments, adding details she had overlooked. She contacted the County Historical Society and obtained records about the property's early ownership. She researched the chemist who had analyzed the spring water in 1875 and discovered he had been a respected figure in Denver's scientific community, which added credibility to the mineral analysis. She built her case the way she had once built dinner parties for Douglas's clients, with meticulous attention to detail and the understanding that every element mattered. And then May came, and May nearly destroyed her. It started with fatigue, not the ordinary tiredness of physical labor which she had grown accustomed to. This was something deeper, a heaviness in her chest, a persistent cough that would not clear, aching joints that screamed louder than usual. She ignored it the way she had been ignoring her body's complaints for months, pushing through, telling herself that rest was for people who had someone else to pick up the slack. By the second week of May, she could not ignore it anymore. The cough had become constant. Her fever spiked at night, soaking her blankets with sweat, then dropped in the morning, leaving her shivering and weak. She had been working in mold-compromised conditions for months, breathing spores despite the mask, pushing her body past every reasonable limit. The mountain had finally collected its toll. Lorraine spent 5 days in bed, not by choice, by necessity. Her body simply refused to function. She lay in the cabin she had cleaned and repaired and fought for, and she could not lift her head without the room spinning. She rationed the water bottles she had stored. She ate crackers and canned soup. She had no phone signal in the cabin. No way to call for help, even if she had wanted to. The cabin that had been her salvation now felt like a trap, its walls pressing. In the silence that had once felt like mercy, now feeling like abandonment. She was alone on a mountain, too sick to drive, too weak to walk to the road, and nobody in the world knew exactly how bad it was. On the second day, she dragged herself to the wood stove to add logs. The fire had nearly died overnight, and the cabin temperature had dropped to the point where she could see her breath. She fed the stove with shaking hands and crawled back to her sleeping bag and lay there watching the ceiling, thinking about all the ways this could end. Not dramatically, not tragically, just quietly. A woman alone on a mountain who got sick and did not get better. It happened more often than anyone talked about. People disappeared into remote places, and the world simply moved on without them. On the third day, she seriously considered quitting. She lay in the dark, too weak to stand, too feverish to think clearly, and she thought about calling Shelby, asking to come stay in the spare room. Admitting that Douglas was right, that she was too old for this, that the cabin and the spring and all of it had been a desperate fantasy. On the fourth day, she managed to drive to Ridgecrest. She sat in the diner parking lot with enough signal to make a call. She dialed Shelby's number with the intention of surrendering. Shelby answered on the third ring. "Mom, are you okay?" "You sound terrible. I am tired," Lorraine said, and she meant it in every possible way. "Do you want to come stay with us for a while?" Shelby asked. And then, almost as an afterthought, almost casually, she added the sentence that changed everything. "Dad says you will come crawling back eventually. He told Garrett that last week. Said it was only a matter of time." Silence on the line. A long silence. Lorraine felt the words enter her like a cold blade. Not the pain of them, the fury. Douglas was waiting, sitting in whatever comfortable life he had arranged for himself, waiting for the phone call that would prove him right. Waiting for her to fail. Using the word crawling. Reducing her to something on its hands and knees, broken and begging. Something detonated in Lorraine's chest. Something old and deep and absolutely immovable. I have to go, she told Shelby. Her voice had changed. Mom, are you sure you are all right? I am fine. I will call you next week. She hung up. She drove back to her cabin. She drank water. She took aspirin. She slept for 14 hours. And when she woke up, the fever had broken. Not because of medicine or rest, because of rage, because Douglas Prescott had given her the one thing she needed more than antibiotics, a reason to refuse to die. Over the next 2 weeks, Lorraine nursed herself back to functional. Not healthy, not fully recovered, but functional. She started with short walks around the cabin, 10 minutes at first, then 20, then 30, building her strength back the way you rebuild anything slowly and with respect for the process. She drank water by the gallon. She made herself eat real food instead of crackers, driving to Ridgecrest for fresh vegetables and protein, spending money she could barely afford because she understood now that her body was not just a vehicle for her ambition, but the foundation it rested on. Break the foundation and everything built on it comes down. When she was strong enough to sit at her laptop for extended periods, she rewrote the grant proposal. She made it sharper, more detailed, more compelling. She included additional photographs of the historical documents, close-ups of the engineering drawings that showed the precision of the original bathhouse design. And she included water samples she had collected from the spring and sent to a certified laboratory in Denver using the last $300 of her savings. $300 she could not afford to spend. $300 that represented the difference between eating for the next month and going hungry. She spent them without hesitation because some bets you have to make with everything you have. The lab results came back in early June. The mineral content was exceptional. Concentrations of therapeutic minerals that matched or exceeded the values from 1875. The lab technician had written a note at the bottom of the report, a single sentence that Lorraine would frame and hang on her wall. This is a remarkable water source. Truly unusual. She included the lab results with her revised application. 2 weeks later, she received a phone call. They were approving the grant. Full funding for environmental assessment, historical designation review, and partial funding for initial site development. Lorraine was sitting on her porch when she took the call. The porch she had rebuilt herself board by board. She listened to the woman from the Preservation Fund explain the terms. She said the right things. She was professional and composed. And when she hung up, she put her face in her hands and wept. Not the desperate, broken crying of the woman in the courthouse parking lot. These were different tears, the tears of a woman who had bet everything on herself and won. The trees were green now. Spring had come to the mountain. And Lorraine sat on her rebuilt porch in the June sunshine and felt something settle into place inside her chest. Not happiness exactly. Something better. Purpose. Douglas had tried to bury her in this mountain. Instead, he had planted her. And against every odd, against every expectation, Lorraine Prescott had begun to grow. The grant changed everything. Not overnight, not in the dramatic, cinematic way that stories sometimes suggest, where money arrives and problems vanish like fog in morning sun. The grant changed everything slowly, methodically, the way real transformation happens. One decision at a time, one board at a time, one day of labor stacked on top of the last until the accumulation becomes something that cannot be ignored. The funding from the Colorado Historical Preservation Fund covered three things: environmental assessment of the spring and surrounding land, review and processing of the historical designation application, and partial funding for initial site development, enough to begin construction on a small bathhouse structure that would serve as both a preservation project and the foundation for a commercial operation. Lorraine hired carefully. She could not afford mistakes, and she could not afford people who saw her as a charity case or a curiosity. She interviewed the environmental engineer in Denver over the phone for 40 minutes before agreeing to bring him on, asking questions she had prepared from weeks of research, making sure he understood that this was not a hobby project run by a bored retiree. This was a business, her business. She found an architect in Colorado Springs who had experience with historical restoration projects and who, more importantly, listened when she spoke instead of talking over her the way men in professional settings had been talking over her for her entire life. She found a small construction crew from Ridgecrest, local men who knew the mountain and the weather, and the particular challenges of building at altitude, men who showed up on time and did their work without complaint and did not treat a 63-year-old woman on a construction site as a novelty. And she worked alongside every one of them. This was not a woman who wrote checks and supervised from the porch with a cup of coffee. Lorraine was on site every day from the first light of morning until the crew packed up in the evening. She hauled lumber until her shoulders burned. She mixed mortar until her arms shook. She learned to read architectural drawings and argue about drainage grades and debate the merits of different stone finishes for the soaking pools with an expertise that surprised the professionals she had hired. The construction foreman, a weathered man named Dale, who had been building things in these mountains for 30 years, and had seen every kind of client from absentee investors to micromanaging retirees, told her during the first week that she did not need to be out here every day. She could manage from inside. Plenty of owners did. Most owners did, in fact. Lorraine looked at him with the calm, immovable expression of a woman who had survived a winter alone in a condemned cabin with nothing but a wood stove and a fury that would not die. "Every nail in this place is mine," she said. "I am not managing from anywhere." Dale studied her for a moment. He had been in construction long enough to recognize the difference between enthusiasm and commitment between someone playing at building and someone who needed it like oxygen. He saw which one she was. He handed her a pair of safety goggles and put her to work. By the end of the first month, he had stopped treating her like a client and started treating her like a colleague. She had earned that with blisters and sweat and the quiet refusal to be anywhere except where the work was happening. The cabin itself continued its transformation alongside the bathhouse project. Lorraine had been restoring it in stages since December, teaching herself each skill as she needed it, failing, and trying again with the dogged persistence of someone who has learned that failure is not the enemy, but quitting is. Now, with the grant providing resources and the construction crew occasionally lending expertise and strong backs during lunch breaks, the work accelerated. She installed proper insulation, learning the difference between fiberglass and foam board the hard way, when the first batch she bought turned out to be wrong for a mountain climate and had to be torn out and replaced at her own expense. A $300 mistake that she could not afford and that taught her to research before she purchased. She ran plumbing with the help of YouTube tutorials and 2 phone calls to Hank, who talked her through pipe fitting with the patience of a man who understood that some lessons only stick when you learn them yourself. The first attempt leaked. The second attempt leaked less. The third attempt held, and Lorraine stood in her kitchen, watching water flow from a faucet she had connected with her own hands, and felt something close to what astronauts must feel when they see the Earth from space. A sense of scale, a recognition that what had seemed impossible was not. She refinished the original wood floors, the boards that had survived 2 decades of neglect and abuse, sanding them by hand because she could not afford to rent a floor sander, working on her knees for days, until the wood grain emerged from beneath years of grime and water damage, like something precious being excavated from the earth. The original wood was beautiful, she discovered. Wide plank pine, golden and warm, with knots and grain patterns that told the story of the trees that had once grown on this mountain. It had been hidden under filth, dismissed as ruined, written off as worthless. But with patience and effort, and the willingness to see what others had refused to look at, it became the most beautiful feature of the cabin. The floors glowed in the afternoon light, warm and alive, and every person who visited commented on them. Lorraine noticed the metaphor. She did not say it aloud. She did not need to. She replaced the damaged logs in the exterior walls, a job that required help from the crew, and a level of structural engineering she had not anticipated. She rebuilt the porch completely, tearing out the collapsed section and constructing a new one that was wider and stronger than the original, a porch designed not merely for function, but for living, with enough room for chairs and a table, and a view of the sunset that would stop you in your tracks every evening if you let it. She stained the wood herself on a warm September afternoon, working slowly and carefully, savoring the work the way you savor a meal you have earned. By September, 1 year after she had arrived at the cabin in a 12-year-old sedan with her life in boxes, the property was unrecognizable. The cabin was charming, rustic but modern, warm in winter, cool in the mountain summers, with wide windows she had installed herself that framed the pine forest and the distant peaks like paintings you could reach through and touch. The main room had become a combination office and living space, with the old stone fireplace restored and functional, and crackling with fire on cool evenings, a desk built from reclaimed wood by a local carpenter she had befriended, and shelves lined with books on mineral therapy and historical preservation and small business management. And in one corner, the cedar box that had started it all displayed like the artifact it was. It was a home. Her home. The first home in her life that was entirely unambiguously, unarguably hers. The bathhouse was taking shape in the clearing near the spring. A small structure historically designed to echo the 1875 drawings found in the cedar box, but built to modern safety and accessibility standards. 3 private soaking rooms, each fed by channels from the spring, the water naturally heated and mineral-rich, flowing through stone pools that the architect had designed to look as though they had been there for a century. The stone was local quarried from the mountain itself, and Lorraine had insisted on it, even though it cost more than prefabricated alternatives. This place would be authentic. Every piece of it would be real. She had spent a lifetime surrounded by constructed appearances. This would be built from truth. Water testing confirmed what the old documents and the Denver lab had reported. The mineral content was exceptional. The therapeutic properties were documented and scientifically verifiable. The spring was not just historically significant, it was genuinely measurably valuable. They were pursuing designation as a Colorado historical site and permits to offer therapeutic bathing services to the public. Lorraine stood in the clearing one evening in late September, watching the last light of day turn the bathhouse stone golden, and she tried to reconcile the woman standing here with the woman who had sat in a courthouse parking lot crying into her steering wheel 1 year ago. They did not seem like the same person. They were not the same person. That woman had measured herself by another person's judgment and found herself wanting. This woman measured herself by what she had built and found herself enough. In October, a regional magazine called Mountain Living ran a story about the project. The journalist, a young woman from Denver who covered heritage tourism, had heard about the property through the Preservation Fund and driven up to Ridgecrest to see it for herself. She spent 2 days at the site interviewing Lorraine over coffee on the rebuilt porch, photographing the cabin and the bathhouse in the spring, carefully reviewing the historical documents that Lorraine had preserved in archival sleeves. The article ran with the headline, "From Divorce to Discovery, One Woman's Mountain Miracle." It told Lorraine's story in full. The long marriage, the divorce, the worthless property given as a final insult, the hidden compartment behind the kitchen wall, the century-old documents, the spring still flowing after all these years, the transformation of both the land and the woman who owned it. The journalist wrote with genuine admiration, and the photographs told their own powerful story. Lorraine in a flannel shirt and work boots, standing on the porch, she had rebuilt sawdust still in her hair from the morning's work. Lorraine kneeling beside the spring mineral water flowing over her calloused hands. Lorraine in the restored cabin, surrounded by the 1875 drawings and modern blueprints, a woman who had learned to build a future from materials everyone else had thrown away. Lorraine saw herself in those photographs and barely recognized the woman looking back. She had lost 20 pounds from months of physical work. Her face was tanned and lined, weathered by mountain sun and winter cold, but in a way, it had not been alive in decades. There was something in her eyes that had not been there before. Not happiness exactly. Something harder than happiness and more durable. Resolve. Ownership. The look of a person who has faced the worst and discovered it could not destroy her. Her hair, which she had stopped coloring the month she left the suburban house, was silver now, pulled back in a practical bun. She wore jeans and flannel and boots with mud on the soles. She looked nothing like the carefully maintained suburban wife she had been for all those years. She looked like someone who had built something with her own hands. She looked powerful. The article brought attention Lorraine had not sought and did not entirely want. Investors reached out asking about opportunities. Spa consultants offered their services. Wellness influencers wanted to visit and photograph themselves in the mineral pools. But it was the letters from women that affected her most deeply. Dozens of them at first, then hundreds arriving by email and postal mail and through every channel available. Women who had been through their own divorces. Women who had been told they were too old, too used up, too past their prime to start anything new. Women who saw in Lorraine's story the proof they needed that starting over was possible after 60. Lorraine had not set out to be a symbol. She had set out to survive. But survival, she was learning, was itself a powerful message. The mere act of continuing, of refusing to disappear, was an argument against every voice that said she should. She started a blog. She called it Rebuilding at 62. She wrote honestly about everything. The physical difficulty of manual labor at her age, the mornings when getting out of bed required an act of will. The financial terror of building a business with no safety net. The loneliness of mountain isolation, the evenings when the silence pressed in too close. But she also wrote about the freedom, the pride, the specific, irreplaceable joy of standing in a place you built and knowing that every piece of it is yours. Not because someone gave it to you, not because someone allowed it, because you made it happen with blistered hands and a stubborn heart. The blog resonated. Within months, she had thousands of followers, mostly women over 50, but not exclusively. People of all ages who had lost something and were trying to figure out what came next. They formed a community around the simple idea that human beings do not have expiration dates. The bathhouse opened for therapeutic bathing in March, 18 months after Lorraine had first arrived at the cabin. The opening was quiet, deliberately so. No grand ceremony, no ribbon cutting, just a small notice in the Ridgecrest weekly paper and a listing on the Historical Preservation Fund's website, and word passed mouth to mouth in the mountain community that had watched this woman arrive with nothing and build something from the wreckage. The first guest was a retired school teacher from Boulder who had read about the property online. She soaked in the mineral water for 45 minutes and emerged with tears in her eyes, not from the therapeutic properties of the water, but from the story behind it. She told Lorraine that she had been thinking about leaving her husband for 3 years and had never found the courage. Lorraine did not give her advice. She just listened the way she wished someone had listened to her. 3 private soaking rooms open by appointment only. 2 part-time employees from Ridgecrest, a young woman who handled scheduling, and a retired plumber who managed the water systems. Modest but steady revenue each month, slightly better than the last, growing in the organic way that genuine things grow, without force, without manipulation, simply by being good enough that people told other people about it. Some visitors came for the mineral baths, others came for Lorraine. They wanted to meet the woman from the article, to sit on her porch and see proof that reinvention after 60 was real. She welcomed them all. She gave tours. She showed the historical documents from the cedar box. She told her story when asked, because she had learned that one woman's survival can become another woman's permission to try. One afternoon, a woman named Dorothy visited. About 70, white-haired, recently widowed after nearly 50 years. She sat on Lorraine's porch with a cup of tea and said the thing that so many women of their generation had been trained to believe. "I do not know who I am without him. I was his wife for so long that I forgot I was anything else." Lorraine understood that feeling in her bones. "You are not nothing," she told Dorothy. "You are someone who devoted nearly 50 years to a partnership. That is extraordinary. But you are also someone separate, someone with dreams that got put aside. It is not too late to pick them up. At 70, I started at 62. You are ahead of the game." Dorothy cried. Good tears, the kind that come when something inside you cracks open and lets light in. Before she left, she hugged Lorraine tightly. "Thank you for showing us it is possible." That conversation, overheard by a visitor who wrote for a wellness blog, went viral online. Suddenly, Lorraine was getting interview requests, speaking invitations. Visitors arriving not for the baths, but for the woman who ran them. Shelby visited that autumn. She came alone without her husband, and Lorraine knew before her daughter said a word that something was wrong. They sat on the porch in the October evening aspens, turning gold on the mountainside, and Shelby told her mother that her marriage was in trouble, that her husband had grown distant, that she felt invisible in her own home. The word invisible landed between them with the weight of shared history. "I do not want to end up where you were," Shelby said quietly. "Neither do I," Lorraine replied. "So do not wait to demand respect. Do not make yourself smaller to make someone else comfortable. Do not confuse being needed with being valued. And if you do end up divorced, remember that it might be the best thing that ever happened to you." Something shifted behind Shelby's eyes. The beginning of resolution. Garrett brought his family for Thanksgiving. His children ran through the grounds with wild joy. Lorraine taught them about the spring, about minerals and geothermal energy. She watched them play in the clearing where she had knelt in the snow, and she felt a gratitude so deep it was almost pain. In the second year, the blog grew to 50,000 followers. Podcast called. Regional news covered her story. She was invited to speak at a women's entrepreneurship conference in Denver. One blog post resonated above all others. She wrote about the day she almost quit about Douglas's words relayed through Shelby. For the entire length of my marriage, his opinion of me was my opinion of me. His approval was my compass. The greatest gift of this journey was learning that I could thrive without his validation. That post was shared tens of thousands of times. And then on a Tuesday afternoon in the autumn of the second year, Douglas came back. Lorraine was outside working with the crew on a bathhouse expansion, a fourth soaking room, when she heard an engine laboring up the rutted road. An expensive sedan, absurdly out of place, struggling over ruts and rocks, bottoming out twice before stopping in the clearing. Douglas Prescott got out. Lorraine's stomach clenched. A physical reaction, involuntary and immediate. She had not seen him in 2 years. She had built an entire life in the space his absence had created, and now here he was standing in the middle of it. He looked diminished, not just older, smaller. His expensive suit hung on him differently, as if the man inside it had contracted. His face was drawn. His hair had thinned. He stared at the transformed property with disbelief, and beneath it something worse. Regret. Lorraine, he said. Douglas, 15 feet apart. The crew had stopped working, watching silently. I read the article, Douglas said. About all of this, I had no idea the property was valuable. If I had known, I would have kept it, Lorraine finished. The way you kept everything else. He shifted uncomfortably. Things have been difficult. Vanessa and I are no longer together. She had left when the money dried up. The market shifted. Investments failed. Then his voice shifted into the negotiating tone she recognized from decades of marriage. And since this property was technically marital property, I believe I am entitled to a percentage of its current value. My lawyer believes. Stop, she said it quietly, but it carried across the clearing like thunder. You gave me this property as a joke, a final insult. You laughed at me in the courthouse. You told me to try not to let it collapse on me. Your girlfriend giggled. You wanted me to spend whatever years I had left staring at ruins and understanding how little you thought I was worth. And now that I have made something of it, you want a piece. I'm just saying that legally. The divorce is final. The property was deeded to me. Your lawyers drafted it. You signed it laughing. Whatever value it has exists because of my work, my discoveries, my grants. You contributed nothing except contempt. His face reddened. Lorraine, I am struggling. After everything I did for you, after everything you did for me, after decades of managing your household, raising your children, entertaining your clients, giving up my own ambitions, making your entire life work so you could take credit. You do not get to come here now and claim you are owed anything. I gave you a comfortable life, he said, his voice cracking. You gave me a pay, and when I got too old to decorate it, you threw me away. Look around, Douglas. Look at what the woman you called invisible built while you were busy destroying everything you had. She stepped closer so he could see her clearly. The sun-darkened skin, the silver hair, the eyes that held no fear. You set me free, she said. By trying to destroy me, you saved me. This place taught me that I was never the worthless one. Not because your business failed, because you looked at a lifetime of partnership and saw nothing worth keeping. That is your poverty, not mine. Long silence. Wind through the pines, a bird calling in the distance. Douglas stood with his expensive car and his diminished body and his failed business, looking at the woman he had discarded, standing before the empire she had built from his contempt. I made a mistake, he said quietly. The arrogance was gone. What remained was smaller and honest and irreversibly too late. With you, with Vanessa, with all of it. I hope you find your own way forward, Lorraine said. But your regret is not my responsibility. I spent a lifetime making your comfort my responsibility. I am done. She turned her back and walked toward the crew. She heard his car start, heard it struggle down the rutted road until the sound disappeared into the forest and the silence in the past. She did not watch it leave. That evening on her porch, a glass of wine in hand, the sunset painting the mountains gold and amber and deep burning purple, Lorraine felt something settle in her chest like an anchor reaching bottom. Closure. Not the closure of revenge. The closure of knowing she could stand before the man who broke her and feel nothing but her own strength. The following spring, a major spa resort company approached Lorraine about purchasing the property. The CEO flew to Ridgecrest himself, a man in his 50s, with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who acquires properties for a living. He toured the bathhouse. He reviewed the water analysis reports. He studied the historical documents with the careful attention of a man calculating numbers in his head while pretending to appreciate history. Then he sat on Lorraine's porch and named a figure. It was a sum large enough to fund several lifetimes of comfort. A number with enough zeros to make Lorraine's vision blur slightly. Enough to buy back the house on Maple Ridge and every piece of furniture in it. Enough to never work another day. Enough to sit in some comfortable apartment somewhere and spend the rest of her life being comfortable, which was exactly what she had done for 4 decades, and look where that had gotten her. Lorraine turned them down. The CEO was not accustomed to hearing no. He adjusted the offer upward. Lorraine said no again. He adjusted it again. She said no a third time, and this time she explained why not, because he deserved the explanation, but because she wanted to hear herself say it out loud. This property is not for sale. Not because I do not need the money. I do. Not because your offer is unfair. It is generous. I am saying no because selling would mean surrendering the one thing I have built that is entirely mine. The first thing in 65 years of life that exists because of my work and my will and nothing else. I cannot put a price on that because there is no price. You are asking me to sell my identity. That is not something I am willing to do again. The CEO studied her. He had dealt with reluctant sellers before, but he recognized something in Lorraine's face that told him this was not negotiation. This was conviction. He changed his approach. Instead of an acquisition, they negotiated a partnership. The resort company would invest in expanding the facility in exchange for a minority stake, 30%. Lorraine would keep controlling ownership. She would make the decisions. She would preserve the character of the place, its history, its intimacy, the handmade quality that made it different from every corporate wellness center in the country. The resort company would bring capital and marketing expertise and access to networks of travelers and wellness seekers. Lorraine would bring everything else. The deal was signed in June in Lorraine's cabin on the desk she had built from reclaimed wood with Hank from the hardware store as a witness because he was the closest thing she had to a friend in Ridgecrest, and because he had been part of this story from the second chapter, even if he did not know it. By her 66th birthday, the small bathhouse had expanded into a thriving spa retreat. 8 employees from the local community people whose lives had been changed by the presence of Lorraine's business in a town that had been slowly losing its economic pulse. A full appointment schedule booked months in advance. Historical tours that drew visitors from across the state. Wellness programs designed around the mineral water's therapeutic properties. Revenue that was not just steady, but growing month over month in the quiet, sustainable way that real businesses grow when they are built on something genuine. Lorraine had become a significant local business owner. The woman who had arrived in Ridgecrest 2.5 years ago buying cleaning supplies and looking like someone the world had chewed up, that woman had been replaced by someone the town respected. Someone the town claimed as their own. Someone whose story had become part of the community's story. 2 years after the expansion, Douglas filed for bankruptcy. The commercial real estate career he had valued above everything else, above his marriage, above his family, above the woman who had spent a lifetime enabling it, was gone. He was selling the house on Maple Ridge, the house Lorraine had maintained for 3 decades. She felt a brief pang when she heard a momentary sadness for the memories in those walls. Then it passed like a cloud across the sun. She did not want that house. It had been a beautiful cage and she was free. 5 years after the divorce at 67, Lorraine stood at a podium in a Denver conference hall and looked out at an audience of 400 women, entrepreneurs over 50, business owners who had started late and succeeded anyway, rebuilders, women who had been told in 1,000 different ways that their best years were behind them and had decided each in her own way, each through her own struggle to prove the world wrong. The conference organizer had introduced her as an inspiration, a word Lorraine still did not fully accept. She had not done what she did to inspire anyone. She had done it to survive. But she had learned over these 5 years that sometimes surviving is the most inspiring thing a person can do. That the mere act of continuing, of showing up, of refusing to accept someone else's verdict on your worth is a kind of revolution. I am 67 years old, Lorraine began. Her voice was steady. The hands that gripped the podium were the same hands that had gripped a crowbar in a ruined cabin, that had dug warm water from frozen ground, that had held a cedar box full of history and possibility. When I was 62, my husband told me I was invisible. When I was 62, I lost everything I thought defined me: my home, my marriage, my identity, my sense of worth. When I was 62, I believed my life was over. She paused. The room was silent. 400 women holding their breath, each one carrying her own version of the story Lorraine was about to tell. I was wrong about all of it. She told the real version, not the magazine version, not the blog version. The version she told to the walls of her cabin on the nights when the silence pressed in too close. The crying on the floor of a ruined building. The blistered hands and the aching back and the cold that settled into her bones and stayed. The mold she had scrubbed from walls while wearing a mask that fogged her glasses. The fever that had nearly killed her, that had laid her flat for 5 days in a cabin with no phone signal and no one who knew how sick she was. The morning she sat in a parking lot with her phone in her hand, ready to call her daughter and surrender, ready to admit that everyone who said she could not do it was right. And the 5 words that detonated something in her chest and sent her back up the mountain with rage in her blood and a refusal in her heart that was stronger than any fever. He says, "You will come crawling back." The last 5 years have been the most difficult of my life, she said. They have also been the most honest. I learned to patch a roof. I learned to lay pipe. I learned to sand a floor and split firewood and write a grant proposal and negotiate a business deal and stand in front of a man who broke me and tell him that I am done. I learned that I am stronger than I ever knew. And I learned that I was never invisible. I was just surrounded by people who refused to see. She looked out at the audience. 400 faces, some crying, some nodding, and all listening with the fierce attention of women who recognize their own lives in someone else's words. For the first time, I am living a life that I built, not a life I was given, not a life I maintained for someone else, mine. And I am here to tell every woman in this room that it is never too late, that your life does not end at 50 or 60 or 70, that starting over is terrifying and exhausting and the hardest thing you will ever do. And it is worth it. Every blister, every tear, every sleepless night, worth it. Because on the other side of the worst thing that ever happened to you is the person you were always supposed to become. The standing ovation lasted 4 minutes. Lorraine stood at the podium and let it wash over her. Not because she needed the applause, but because she understood that it was not really for her. It was for every woman in that room who had been told she was finished and was still standing. It was for Dorothy and Shelby and every stranger who had written to the blog and every woman who had never written but had read every word and felt something inside her shift. It was for the woman Lorraine herself had been the one crying on the courthouse parking lot, the one who almost quit. That woman deserved this moment. She had earned it with everything she had. That evening, back in her mountain cabin, Lorraine sat on the porch she had rebuilt and watched the stars appear over Colorado. The air was cold and clean and carried the scent of pine and the faintest trace of mineral water from the spring below. The cabin glowed behind her warm light through the windows she had installed, spilling across the boards she had nailed, illuminating the home she had made from what was meant to be her grave. Somewhere beneath the mountain, the spring still flowed warm water, rising through ancient rock the way it had for centuries, patient and persistent and indifferent to the dramas played out on the surface above. The greatest treasure had never been the mineral spring. Lorraine knew that now with the quiet certainty that comes from lived experience rather than received wisdom. The spring was valuable, yes. It had provided the economic foundation for everything she had built. But the real treasure was not geological. It was not hidden in the earth or concealed behind a wall. The real treasure had been the necessity of rebuilding itself, the brutal, beautiful process that had stripped away every false identity she had worn for decades and forced her to discover who she really was beneath a lifetime of compromise and accommodation and silence. She had been a wife. She had been a mother. She had been a homemaker, a hostess, a support system, an audience for someone else's ambitions. She had been all of those things willingly and, for the most part, with love. But she had never been only herself. She had never stood in a place that was hers and known that she had earned it every board and stone and nail through her own labor and her own decisions and her own stubborn refusal to accept someone else's judgment of her worth. Douglas had thought he was discarding something worthless. Instead, he had cut her free. He had handed her, wrapped in contempt and mockery, the key to a life she never would have found inside the comfortable prison of their marriage. If he had stayed, if he had never met Vanessa, if the divorce had never happened, she would have grown old in that beautiful house, comfortable and cared for, and slowly, quietly disappearing into the role she had been assigned until there was nothing left of the woman she might have been. Instead, she was here, on a mountain she had climbed, in a cabin she had saved, running a business she had imagined into existence, surrounded by the evidence of her own capability. 67 years old and more alive than she had been at 27 or 47 or any of the ages when the world had told her she was in her prime. She raised her glass to the night sky. "Thank you, Douglas," she whispered, "for underestimating me, for throwing me away, for giving me the greatest gift you ever gave me, the chance to discover that I never needed you at all." She drank, she smiled, and she sat in the silence of her mountain completely and entirely free. The divorce had not been her ending. It had been her liberation. And the cabin Douglas Prescott had given her as trash had become the treasure chest that held her real life. It had been waiting all along, hidden behind a rotting wall, buried beneath a century of neglect, patient and preserved and ready. All she had to do was be stubborn enough to find it, and brave enough to claim it. What they called her ending life called her beginning.